Welcome to today's deep dive. We are so glad you're joining us for this one because we're zeroing in on a really fascinating, highly specific set of gardening notes today.
Yeah, we're looking at the life cycle and the really unique traits of a plant called the Brazilian Snapdragon.
Right, also known as Achetaria azurea. And, I want you to just imagine something for a second. Imagine taking a delicate little garden cutting, shoving it into a space so tight that its root system it essentially strangles itself.
Hmm.
And then you rip it out and you throw it into a completely foreign soil environment.
Which is, a massive trauma for a plant.
Exactly. By all standard biological logic,
Hmm.
that plant should go into severe shock, right? I mean, it should drop its leaves, hunker down, or just outright die.
Oh, absolutely.
But the plant we're looking at today, it doesn't just survive that trauma. It immediately, bypasses dormancy and just explodes into bloom. So today we're finding out exactly how.
It really is a masterclass in survival physiology. By looking closely at this one specific plant's behavior, tracking its journey from a tiny cutting to a flowering plant, we can actually learn a ton about plant hardiness, identification, and propagation.
Right. But to truly appreciate the flower, I feel like we first have to understand the incredibly stressful conditions it overcame just to survive.
Yeah, the odds were definitely against it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you've ever felt the guilt of buying a nursery plant, leaving it in its little plastic pot for a month, and then finally pulling it out, only to find this dense, tangled, brick-like mess of roots.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Well, this plant is your ultimate redemption story. The source material we're analyzing focuses on these Achetaria azurea cuttings that had become severely root-bound.
Which, from a physiological standpoint, that is a critical bottleneck. I think we
Yeah.
usually just think of root-bound plants as just needing a bigger house.
Yeah, they just need to stretch their legs.
Right. But the reality is actually much more dire. When roots hit the wall of a container, they circle back, and they eventually displace the soil entirely. So you aren't just out of space, you are out of the medium that holds water and nutrients.
It's like being forced to wear shoes that are 3 sizes too small, and then someone tells you to go run a marathon.
That is a perfect analogy.
And trying to water it is like trying to drink a thick milkshake through a straw that's tied in a knot. I mean, the roots circle the pot so tightly they create this waterproof wall. You can water the pot all you want, but the moisture just runs down the plastic sides, you know. It never penetrates the center where the plant is actively starving.
That is precisely the mechanism of failure. The outer layer of roots actually becomes hydrophobic. So the plant is simultaneously suffocating from a lack of oxygen exchange, and it's starving.
Wow.
Yeah. So when the gardener in our source notes finally repotted these cuttings, taking those tight shoes off so the plant had room to breathe, they were intervening in a slow-motion biological crisis.
But the wild thing is, the intervention itself is usually a crisis. You rip those roots apart, you expose them to light, you break the microscopic root hairs. The standard operating procedure for a plant in that scenario is to just shut down.
They halt growth entirely.
Right. They drop foliage to reduce transpiration. But the notes explicitly state that these specific cuttings acclimated instantly. Not only that, they started blooming while they were still incredibly small. How does a plant that was just starving suddenly have the massive caloric energy required to push out a flower?
This is where we really have to look at the mechanisms of stress-induced flowering. It's not just that the plant has a cheerful will to live, it's an evolutionary panic button.
Oh, I love that phrase.
Yeah, when certain plants experience severe environmental stress, like prolonged drought or the literal starvation of being root-bound, their internal hormonal balance shifts dramatically. Hormones like abscisic acid surge, signaling that the plant's life may actually be ending.
So the plant thinks, I'm dying, I need to reproduce immediately before it's too late.
Exactly. It diverts every last scrap of stored energy away from vegetative growth. So no making new leaves or stems, and it channels it directly into sexual reproduction.
Wow.
The goal is to produce seeds before the clock runs out.
Wow.
But what makes this specific case study so fascinating is the timing of it all.
Because the environment changed, right?
Right.
The gardener repotted it right as it was hitting that panic button.
Right. It was already metabolically committed to an emergency bloom due to the root-bound stress.
Yeah.
But suddenly, the restriction is gone.
The knot is untied.
Yes. The repotting provided a sudden influx of unknotted space, water, and nutrients. The plant stabilized its root system almost immediately, but that hormonal cascade for flowering had already been triggered, so it just hits the ground running.
That's incredible.
It utilizes the new resources to fuel the emergency reproductive cycle it had already started, which results in a remarkably fast, premature bloom on a tiny plant.
It's essentially taking the momentum of a panic attack and turning it into this hyperproductive sprint, which leads us to the physical result of all that physiological drama. It poured all its emergency energy into this bloom. So what did the flower actually look like?
Well, the notes offer some fantastic, albeit lightly critical, aesthetic observations. The source mentions that the Brazilian Snapdragon features a very distinct corolla tube.
Right. And the observer specifically describes this tube as being long and slender, which, structurally speaking, gives the plant a very distinct architectural profile.
It does. What's fascinating here is that structurally, that long, slender tube is doing a lot of work. But before we get to the function of it, we have to talk about the color.
Oh, yeah.
The notes highlight that this plant produces a vibrant, really saturated violet blue.
And this is where the comparison to its namesake gets really interesting, because the source explicitly states that true snapdragons, like the classic garden center varieties we all know, they do not produce this color.
They physically cannot. True snapdragons, which belong to the genus Antirrhinum, actually lack the genetic pathway to synthesize true blue or violet blue pigments.
Wait, really? They can't make blue at all?
No. They rely on different anthocyanins to give you pinks, reds, yellows, and whites.
Yeah.
To get that striking violet blue seen in the Achetaria azurea, a plant needs the genetic blueprint to produce specific, complex pigments, often derived from a molecule called delphinidin.
Okay.
And on top of that, it has to maintain a very specific, slightly alkaline pH in its cellular vacuoles, just to reflect that blue light.
So it's performing highly specialized cellular chemistry just to achieve that color.
Exactly.
But here's the part of the notes that I really had to pause on. We have a plant that survived a near-death experience, right? It has a highly unique, elongated corolla tube, and it produces a rare, exclusive violet blue color that traditional snapdragons can't even touch. Those sound like incredible traits. Yet the gardener explicitly notes that visually, it isn't their absolute favorite flowering plant. Why would someone look at this botanical marvel and say, it's not my favorite?
It really exposes the tension between scientific uniqueness and conventional horticultural beauty.
Yeah, and I actually have a theory on this. I think it's an uncanny valley effect caused by the common name. When you hear the word snapdragon, your brain instantly boots up a very specific visual expectation.
You expect a certain look.
You expect a thick, dense, two-lipped flower, the kind that looks like a little jaw you can squeeze open and shut. You expect visual weight.
Right, the bilabiate flower structure. It's bulky, it's robust.
Exactly. So your brain is expecting this bulky jaw-like flower, but then your eyes process the Brazilian Snapdragon. Instead of a dense jaw, you have this long, slender, almost spindly tube leading to the flower face.
Yeah, it's totally different.
Even though the violet blue color is stunning, the proportions feel inherently wrong because the label Snapdragon set the wrong parameters for beauty. It's like expecting a hearty, stout beer and taking a sip of sparkling water. The water might be objectively crisp and delicious, but your brain rejects it for a second because the expectation was violated.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The elongated proportions completely defy the expectation, but biologically, that long, slender tube isn't trying to win a human beauty contest.
Right.
It is a highly specialized piece of evolutionary engineering. By elongating the corolla tube, the plant is essentially restricting access to its nectar.
Oh, I see.
It is actively filtering out generalist pollinators like a common honeybee whose tongue might just be too short to reach the bottom, and it's selecting for highly specialized pollinators, perhaps specific long-tongued solitary bees or moths.
So it's like a VIP lounge.
Exactly.
The plant is saying, I just spent an enormous amount of metabolic energy surviving a root-bound crisis to produce this blue pigment and this nectar. I'm not giving it away to just any insect that wanders by.
Yes. It wants a pollinator that is highly loyal to its specific flower shade, ensuring its pollen is carried directly to another Achetaria azurea, rather than being wasted on a completely different species.
Okay, but if the plant is visually confusing to a human and physically restricting access with a long, narrow tube, how does it guarantee its chooser, VIP pollinator, actually finds it. I mean, visually, it's competing with hundreds of other blooms in a garden setting.
It doesn't rely entirely on the visual, and this is where the notes reveal the true, definitive fingerprint of this plant. It uses a secondary, entirely invisible beacon.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The scent. The source material points out that the absolute best way to tell you are dealing with a Brazilian variety apart from regular snapdragons isn't visual at all. You have to use your nose. And the scent is entirely unexpected for a flower. It doesn't smell floral or sweet or powdery. It smells like a refreshing mint or an herb garden.
Which is such an incredible detail. We are so visually dominant as a species that we often forget a garden is actually a massive overlapping cloud of invisible chemical signals.
But wait, I have a critical question about this. If the plant smells like mint, we're talking about volatile organic compounds, terpenes, like menthol or pelargon, right?
Great.
Most of the time, when a plant produces those strong, herbal, minty scents, it's using them as a defensive mechanism. It's trying to deter herbivores like deer or chewing insects from eating its leaves.
All right, it's a repellent.
But if the Achetaria azurea is pumping out a minty scent to repel attackers, doesn't that run the massive risk of also repelling the very pollinators it desperately needs to visit that slender blue tube? How does it balance a defensive scent with the need to attract?
That is the genius of volatile organic compound chemistry. To a human nose, minty is just a single refreshing note. But to the insect world, it is a highly complex, high-resolution chemical barcode.
A barcode, wow.
The specific blend of terpenes this plant emits actually acts as a dual-action filter.
So going back to the club analogy, it's like a bouncer at the door of the VIP lounge.
Precisely. To a leaf-chewing caterpillar or an aphid, the concentrated mint compounds act as a neurotoxin or an irritantima. The bouncer turns them away.
Get out of here.
Right. But to the highly specialized pollinator that the long corolla tube is designed for, those exact same chemical compounds signal an exclusive food source. The pollinator has co-evolved to recognize that minty plume not as a threat, but as a neon sign pointing directly to the nectar.
So the minty scent checks IDs at the door. It keeps the parasites out while letting the specialized bees walk right past the velvet rope.
And it does this entirely invisibly. This is why the notes emphasize scent for identification. A gardener might see a dozen blue tubular flowers, but when you lean in and engage a different sense, when you catch that minty terpene profile, you are tapping into the plant's private communication network.
You're reading the barcode.
Exactly. You are reading the chemical barcode that proves definitively that you are holding the Achetaria azurea.
It totally changes how you interact with the plant. You can't just look at it from a distance. You have to physically engage with multiple senses to understand its identity, which brings us to the final outcome of this plant's journey in the notes. We have a plant that is an absolute physiological tank. I mean, it survived the root-bound milkshake knot and the shock of repotting. It's visually striking, but maybe a bit eccentric with its long tube. And it has this highly engineered, dual-purpose, minty scent.
And how does the gardener respond to this really complex profile?
By multiplying it. The source notes conclude with the gardener deciding that the immediate next step is to harvest even more cuttings from this plant to begin an entirely new round of propagation.
They are cloning the survivor.
Exactly. So what does this all mean? It forces us to look at the practical reality of horticulture. The gardener stated on the record that this plant is not their visual favorite, right? It violates their aesthetic expectations.
Right, doesn't look like a snapdragon.
Yet their first instinct is to take a pair of shears, take cuttings, and actively ensure this plant's genetics spread further across their garden. It seems like resilience ultimately trumps aesthetics. Does the hardiness of a plant inherently make it more appealing to propagate?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, in the practical day-to-day reality of gardening, resilience is the absolute most valuable currency.
Yeah.
You can have a plant that produces the most breathtaking, perfectly proportioned blooms imaginable. But if it requires a perfectly calibrated watering schedule, or if it drops all its leaves when the temperature shifts 2 degrees, or if it succumbs to the slightest root stress, well, it becomes a burden. It's a diva.
It just demands too much labor for the reward.
Right. Gardening is a partnership. The Brazilian Snapdragon held up its end of the bargain. It demonstrated an incredible capacity for what we call cellular titipitancy, the ability of its cuttings to rapidly regenerate a completely new, functioning root system and shoot system, despite severe environmental stress.
It bounced right back.
It proved that it doesn't just want to exist, it wants to colonize.
It's the ultimate low-maintenance employee. It suffered through a terrible working environment in that root-bound pot, got transferred to a new department, and immediately hit all its quarterly targets by blooming early. You don't fire that employee, you promote them. You clone them.
That's a fantastic way to look at it. Yeah. The cycle of propagation isn't just a mechanical gardening task. It is the evolutionary reward for biological hardiness.
Wow.
The gardener is actively selecting for toughness. The vibrant violet-blue color is a wonderful bonus. The minty scent is a fascinating chemical quirk. But the sheer refusal to die in a tiny pot is what guarantees its legacy.
It's artificial selection happening in real time. The gardener becomes an agent of the plant's evolutionary success, entirely because the plant made itself undeniably useful through its resilience.
And by taking those cuttings, the gardener is building a fundamentally stronger ecosystem in their own backyard. They are filling the space with proven survivors.
So if we look back at the arc of the notes we've unpacked today, it's just an incredible narrative. We started with cuttings that were locked in a hydrophobic death spiral, roots basically choking themselves out. We watched the plant utilize a massive hormonal stress response, not just to survive repotting, but to bypass dormancy entirely and force an emergency bloom.
We examined the structural reality of that bloom, the long, slender corolla tube designed to physically filter pollinators, and the complex genetics required to produce a true violet-blue pigment that standard snapdragons can't even achieve.
And we discovered that the definitive way to identify this plant is invisible, a highly specialized, minty, volatile organic compound that somehow manages to repel predators while acting as a homing beacon for the right guests.
Which is just brilliant.
And finally, we saw how that undeniable, rugged hardiness earned the plant the ultimate prize propagation. The Achetaria azurea is a weird, disproportionate, mint-scented survivor that completely conquered its environment.
It really highlights how much depth exists in just one single horticultural observation.
It really does. But, it also leaves us with a lingering question about how we interact with the natural world. We spend so much time relying on labels.
We do.
We call this plant a Brazilian Snapdragon because it gives us a comfortable frame of reference. But as we discussed, that label creates an expectation of a bulky, jaw-like flower, which causes us to judge this slender, elegant tube as somehow disproportionate or not our favorite.
It's the danger of a misnomer. If a plant has an entirely different structural architecture, if it utilizes complex cell chemistry to synthesize a vibrant violet blue that true snapdragons literally cannot produce, and if it communicates through a refreshing minty terpene cloud rather than a standard floral scent, well, at what point does calling it a snapdragon become a disservice?
Exactly. Does relying on that common name put the plant in a conceptual box that it was never meant to fit in? It makes you wonder how much of the natural world we fail to fully appreciate simply because we're judging it against the wrong label. Maybe the first step to truly understanding a plant's unique identity isn't just taking it out of a restrictive plastic pot, but taking it out of the restrictive categories we force upon it.